Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our January 13th COVID-19 related webinar. My name is Erik Daly, and we'll get started here as people are joining the meeting. Today's topic is related to the Paycheck Protection Program relaunch that is underway this week. I'll get to kind of the substantive updates in a moment. I always like to start our webinars just underscoring that we are approaching as a firm our COVID-19 work and webinar series and client alerts in the spirit of collaboration with clients and community members, other professionals, and with a sense of ingenuity, hopefully. So we hope you'll continue to engage with us, and we appreciate all those who have engaged with us so far, really over the last 9 or 10 months. And we, along with you, I'm sure, continue to support our medical community, healthcare workers, and other essential and frontline workers as we are able to continue to do this work because of those efforts. So with that said, we'll get into today's topic. We can move ahead to the next slide with the agenda, please. And that is the relaunch of the Paycheck Protection Program. Very briefly, I will give an overview of the PPP in general and some recent developments, although I will not rehash all of the latest updates and changes based on the late December stimulus bill. Amy, who is on the call for Miller Johnson, can probably provide a link to the prior webinar that we did summarizing all of the key changes to the PPP based on the latest stimulus bill. And we won't be going through all of those developments today, although I will be touching on some clarifications or modifications to the amendments under the December stimulus bill during this presentation. So I may reference back to some things that we don't talk about in depth today, but there's a lot of good resources on our website that I think Amy is linking to in the chat feature here. We'll talk about some just important basic information about the relaunch, some key takeaways from new interim final rules issued by the Small Business Administration and the Treasury Department based on the latest stimulus bill. I'll mention a few things, just a couple of observations from the new PPP loan application forms that have been posted by SBA and Treasury. And then by way of wind up, let's talk about next steps. There's a quick item I want to mention on PPP forgiveness and the expansion of the employee retention credit under the latest stimulus bill before we wrap up, and then we'll conclude and do some Q&A at the end. So with that, we can move forward with the slides. And the first item I want to talk about is just really quickly for those who are or may not be familiar, just a 10,000-foot overview of the PPP. This is a small business loan program, and the loans are potentially forgivable up to the full amount of the loan, possibly, depending on how you use it and what your employee and compensation and wage levels are during covered forgiveness period. Again, I'm not going to get into all the details around that as we have a lot of resources on our firm page that discuss that in more detail. And the terms of these loans are very favorable for eligible borrowers, even if the loan is ultimately not forgiven. So that's obviously made this a very attractive source of funding for small businesses over the last 9 or 10 months. After the PPP closed initially on August 8th of last year, they had originated a little over 5 million loans with over $525 billion in principal amount, but there were about $130 billion still appropriated when the program closed in August. Some of that money basically being redeployed to support second round loans and to reach borrowers who may not have applied in the first round, plus some additional funding for these the relaunched PPP. So we can keep moving, please, to the next set of slides. Okay, the recent developments, again, this is something we covered in more detail during one of our late December, I think it was actually December 28th, it was the day after the stimulus bill was signed into law, if I remember correctly, a webinar we went through this new set of PPP provisions in more detail. But the latest stimulus bill appropriates about $284 billion to reopening the PPP, both for first-time and second-time borrowers, eligible borrowers. Presently, the funds in the program are only authorized and appropriated through March 31st of 2021. We'll see if that gets extended, particularly given the change in administration and changes in Congress, whether that date gets pushed out more based on subsequent developments and the like. But for now, the hard stop date, both in the legislation itself and as implemented by SBA and Treasury, is March 31st. And within that $284 billion, there are set-asides for, in the sense of specially sort of allocated portions of that $284 billion for first-time borrowers, for certain of the smallest and hardest hit businesses, and then also for certain lenders, smaller lenders and community financial institutions who are, as we'll discuss in a moment, presently the only lenders authorized to or that are able to originate loans and submit them for SBA approval at the moment. As I mentioned, the stimulus bill was signed into law on December 27th. The SBA had 10 days to issue their updated rules to implement the latest stimulus bill, which the 10th day coincided with the events last Wednesday in Washington, D.C. But SBA and Treasury did post and issue the two updated interim final rules very late on Wednesday, January 6th, the 10th day. And then on Friday last week, they posted the updated application forms and announced that the PPP would be reopening, at least for loans originated by community financial institutions this week. So we can go on to the next slide. I think that's by way of background what we're going to cover. Again, there's a lot of good information on our website if you're interested in more, or you can follow up with me certainly if you have questions about any of that background. So where we are now, PPP, as I said, is relaunching this week with CFI, or community financial institutions, initially being the only authorized PPP lenders. After or in the announcement where SBA said they would be reopening the PPP this week, they said that new first round loans could be originated on January 11th, and for at least 2 days, so Monday and Tuesday, but probably, I haven't seen an announcement yet today if they have expanded this beyond community financial institutions, but for at least 2 days, only CFIs would be able to originate first draw PPP loans. So those would be loans for eligible borrowers who have never received a PPP loan previously. And then they said that today, January 13th, they would be opening the PPP loan portal to second draw eligible PPP loan recipients. So those who did receive a loan prior to the August closure of the original PPP loan period. So today, CFIs will be able to, in theory at least, start originating the second draw loans, and then for at least 2 days, they'll be exclusively able to do that. And then at some point, we'll keep an eye out on this. SBA will presumably open up both portals in succession to all eligible PPP lenders. So that's where we are right now. We're in sort of the CFI exclusive period of the PPP relaunch for the most part. Okay, and then as I mentioned, the SBA and Treasury Department issued 2 interim final rules last week. And for those who have been tracking the PPP, not necessarily even in a detailed way, but just, if you've been watching our webinars, you know that there has been just a slew of interim final rules, particularly during the first 6 or 7 months after the PPP was created in late March of 2020. So the first of the new IFRs, or interim final rules, very helpfully consolidates really the key portions of some 23 pre-existing IFRs that had been issued by SBA, and basically puts them all in one document that also reflects updates for the latest December stimulus bill, so the necessary amendments there, such as some of the expanded categories of forgivable expenses. So that's actually quite helpful, which is good to see. Makes it less unwieldy to try to get through the guidance when you have it all consolidated instead of scattered in a bunch of different documents. And the first of these IFRs relates, for the most part, to both first draw and second draw PPP loans. The second IFR that the SBA and Treasury issued last week relates only to so-called second draw PPP loans. So smaller follow-up PPP loans that eligible borrowers can potentially receive if they meet the criteria, if they've used all of their first PPP loan and they're fewer than 300 employees or otherwise qualify for a second loan and satisfy the gross receipts reduction test, which are all, again, discussed in more detail in the webinar that we did, I think, on December 28th. So we'll get into some key takeaways from those IFRs now that provide a little more insight into some of the questions that we had based on the legislation itself. And I'll touch on some of the legislation as we're going through this to provide the necessary context. But as we mentioned before, March 31st is going to be, at least for now, the final day to receive a new PPP loan, whether it's a first draw loan, so first time borrower who just didn't receive a PPP loan before August, or whether it's a second time PPP borrower. March 31st is the hard stop date, unless there's an amendment to a further amendment to the legislation to extend that out. And then the IFR also affirms that the key kind of economic terms of PPP loans haven't changed for the relaunch. So 1% interest rate, although I think they specified, it's a non-compounding, non-adjustable rate in the IFR and in the updated legislation. There's a long payment deferral period so that you don't have to start making payments right away, and if it's forgiven in a relatively generous period of time. You probably won't need to make payments on it. I think you have 10 months after the end of your covered forgiveness period to get your loan forgiveness application in and avoid having to make payments, assuming the loan gets forgiven. Still unsecured, so no collateral required and no personal guarantees. And then, as we discussed, still potentially fully forgivable if used on the right expenses and if other criteria are satisfied. So in calculating your eligible loan amount or your maximum loan amount for either a first draw loan or a second draw loan under the relaunched PPP, the IFR states that you can basically calculate your average monthly payroll costs, which is the base, it's the basis for then multiplying either by 2.5 or 3.5, depending on your industry, to get your maximum loan amount. You can use either calendar year 2019, calendar year 2020, or the 12-month period prior to the loan date. If you look at the IFR, it mostly references either calendar year 2019 or 2020, just for simplicity's sake. But for some borrowers, it would probably be rare that the 12-month period prior to the loan date would also be a period you could use to calculate your loan amount. And related to that, if you're a second time or a second draw borrower and you used calendar year 2019 for your original PPP loans, your first draw loan, the IFR states specifically that you probably do not need to resubstantiate your payroll costs with your lender if you work with the same lender who originated your first draw loan, because you would be calculating your loan amount based on the exact same data. And you want to make sure that you provided the correct information originally, and it's still accurate. But if so, the lender doesn't need to request any additional payroll information, although they're authorized to. So maybe a little bit easier for those who used 2019 originally to do that again. But you'll want to check to see that makes sense otherwise. Okay, the IFR also talks about and implements some of the provisions in the latest legislation relating to implementation of the new 4 categories of forgivable expenses, which are covered operations expenditures, covered property damage costs, covered supplier costs, and covered worker protection expenditures. The IFR does not provide any more detail about definitions really of these terms, because they're pretty well defined in the legislation itself. But it does confirm, and this is also relatively pretty clear in the legislation, but the IFR does make it very clear that for those first draw PPP borrowers who have not whose lenders have not received a remittance payment for a forgiveness amount, that even those first-time PPP borrowers from pre-August 2020 could kind of go back and retroactively use expenses incurred or paid during their covered period in these different categories for forgiveness purposes. And when we get toward the end of the presentation and that discussion around employee retention credits, we'll circle back to this point, but it may be relevant even if a borrower of a first-time PPP loan borrower has enough just in, say, payroll costs. There may be reasons now to use some of these other categories of forgivable expenses, even if you could use payroll costs to cover the entire forgiveness amount originally. So we'll circle back to that toward the end. And then entirely separately, the second large bullet point here, the IFR gives some example situations of when a first draw PPP loan borrower would be able to go back and request an increase in their original first draw PPP loan amount. This is something that we discussed in the webinar in December, that the new stimulus bill gives first-time borrowers who did not receive their maximum loan amount, for example, because they returned a portion of their loan, so they may not, if they were fully shuttered or something, they may not have been able to use it. Or if they didn't borrow the maximum loan amount because of a miscalculation or something. It gives a couple of examples, but there's still not yet a clear process that's been communicated for at least to the public. It may be that the lenders have some information from SBA about the process for requesting sort of max out or top off of the original PPP loan. It'll be available eventually. One note of caution though on that is if a first draw PPP borrower thinks that they are eligible for another PPP loan or second draw loan, one of the requirements to be able to receive the second draw loan is that you must have used all of your first loan on eligible expenses before you can receive the second loan. And the IFR makes it clear that these kind of additional or top up amounts to first loans would count, so you'd have to use that. You'd also have to use all of the top up amount for the first loan before you could receive the second loan. So stepping back, the main point there is just that it could delay your ability to receive the second loan if you go through and wait to apply for the top up of the first draw PPP loan, and you'd have to wait until you received it and then spent it on eligible expenses before you could make the certification in your second loan application that you'd used all your first draw loan amounts. So just be mindful of that. The consolidated IFR is lengthy, but again, it mostly just restates prior guidance as amended for the December stimulus bill. Now we're kind of pivoting to the second of the two IFRs that was issued, and that one is specific to the second draw PPP loans. And this second IFR confirms that second draw PPP loans are generally subject to all the same terms, rules, guidance, FAQs as first draw loans, except where the legislation or IFRs or FAQs expressly provide otherwise. So, when you if you were a first draw PPP borrower, questions that you may have had around, when is a expense deemed incurred or paid, things like that. Those are generally, those same concepts are generally going to apply to a second draw loan unless there's a specific modification made by SBA, Treasury, or legislation related to that, which is good. That makes it a little bit easier to have consistency between both of those programs and to be able to make sure you're using the funds appropriately and complying with program terms. The SBA has not yet updated. I checked this morning, and they still have not yet updated their frequently asked questions or FAQs to reflect the December amendments, and based on the new two new interim final rules. But when those come out, there will probably be some differences highlighted in treatment between the first and second draw loans. So that's an important document just to be aware of and consult with. And it's easy to find on both the SBA and Treasury Department websites. But of course, if you have questions, you can also reach out to us. And then separately, this is a matter of kind of threshold eligibility for a second draw PPP loan. The statute says that to be eligible among other qualifications to be eligible for a second PPP loan or a second draw loan, the borrower generally needs to show that in a calendar quarter of 2020 compared to the corresponding calendar quarter of 2019, and they incurred or experienced a decline in gross receipts of at least 25%. And there are some kind of exceptions and twists on that for, say, seasonal businesses or businesses that weren't operating for all of 2019, but I'm not going to get into all those variations. But for the most part, to be eligible, among other criteria, one of the key criteria or key requirements is that you show this 25% quarter over comparable year quarter in decline in gross receipts. Gross receipts was not defined in the legislation itself, at least for for-profit borrowers. I believe for nonprofit borrowers, it references an Internal Revenue Code definition of gross receipts, but there was no definition included for for-profit borrowers. And IFR adopted, for this purpose, the SBA's existing definition of gross receipts that they use for some of their size-based regulations. And it's a fairly inclusive and encompassing concept of gross receipts. And it's included in the application form for the second draw PPP loan, so you don't have to go digging around for it. It's in the instructions to the second draw loan application form. So you can see what's included there, and just kind of make sure that what you're thinking of in terms of your decline in revenues is consistent, in material ways with the SBA's gross receipts definition. One point that we've gotten a couple questions on, I think, was whether the first draw PPP loan itself would count as gross receipts for this purpose. And the IFR makes it clear that forgiven first draw PPP loans do not count as gross receipts, but it unfortunately does not say how you would treat first draw PPP loans that have not yet been forgiven. They may be ones that are subject to ongoing SBA review, or the borrower just has not yet submitted a forgiveness application for. So we don't have clear guidance yet on whether those are or are not meant to be included in gross receipts. So we'll look for that. I'm hopeful that that'll be addressed by the FAQs, but if you've already had your loan forgiven, then that clearly, based on the IFR, does not count as gross receipts for that 25% reduction test. All right. Another question that we've gotten relates to, first draw PPP borrowers whose loans remain subject to SBA review or who have not yet received a final determination from SBA about their loan forgiveness, and whether getting a final forgiveness determination was a requirement or an eligibility criteria for a second draw PPP loan. The IFR states that if you have a PPP loan forgiveness application with an quote unquote unresolved issue, for example, if your need certification is under review, or if the SBA is asking for more supporting documentation, you won't be able to have your second draw loan funded, and it will not receive a PPP loan number at that time, because the SBA wants to resolve the issues for program integrity purposes before they fund second draw loans in those situations. However, the SBA said that they will be working to resolve those issues, quote unquote, expeditiously, and that subject to appropriations being available, they will set aside amounts to fund those loans pending resolution of whatever issues are under review. So that will result in delays for those PPP first round borrowers who submitted their forgiveness applications but have not yet received a final determination from SBA as to forgiveness. You can, I believe, still go ahead and apply with your lender and get the process started. You just will not receive a loan number, and you won't have your loan funded until the issue is resolved. And hopefully the SBA and the lender will be able to kind of earmark appropriations for that pending application in the meantime. But it's, again, subject to available appropriations. And then there is people who were following the first round of the PPP may remember that the maximum amount for any individual loan in the first round PPP was $10 million. And that the maximum amount of an individual loan for the second round PPP is $2 million. In addition to those caps, there are caps under both the first round and second round program for entire corporate groups. So, for example, restaurants have the benefit potentially of an affiliation of the have the benefit of an exemption from the affiliation rules for different physical locations, assuming they're set up as different legal entities, such that each location could potentially be eligible for either a first round $10 million loan or a second round $2 million loan. But there's a single corporate group cap that says that notwithstanding those affiliation waivers, all the borrowers within that corporate group are subject to, in the case of the first round PPP, it's a $20 million aggregate cap. And now they've set in the IFR for the second draw loans that the aggregate cap for a single corporate group is $4 million. And that's twice the amount of kind of the cap on a single loan, which is the same scaling concept as you saw in the first round with the $10 million individual loan cap and the $20 million cap on all loans for a single corporate group. So that concept remains in place, and it's proportionate to the similar constraint as was applicable in the first round of the PPP. Another exercise of discretion by SBA and Treasury in this IFR is that in addition to being able to satisfy the 25% decline in gross receipts requirement by comparing a single quarter of 2020 to the corresponding quarter of 2019, they adopted an approach where a borrower who has their 2020 federal tax returns done already could potentially compare full year 2020 to full year 2019 to establish the 25% decline in gross receipts. Instead of looking at quarters, you could look at the whole year. But again, the rub there is that, one, the borrower has to have been in operation in all 4 quarters of 2019 so that you have a good year-to-year comparison. And then in addition to that, you have to have your 2020 annual tax returns done and ready to show SBA to take advantage of that modification to the general quarterly comparison period, at least if your loan size will be over $150,000. For loans below $150,000, you don't need to provide the documentation up front to establish the decline in gross receipts, but you will need to provide it when you seek forgiveness. But for larger loans, I'm not sure how useful this year-to-year comparison will be, just because of the larger borrowers may not have their 2020 annual tax returns done in time to take advantage of that and provide that up front to originate their loan. And then the last bullet point here, businesses that have permanently closed are ineligible for second round or believe even first round PPP loans at this point. However, businesses that are only temporarily closed may still be eligible. So that's just something to be aware of. Obviously, in order to have the loan forgiven, you would need to spend it on forgivable expenses. So you need to be in operation at some point going forward to get the forgiveness. But you need to certify in the application that I believe that the business is not permanently closed. So something to be mindful of if you are not presently operating, you should have an intention of reopening so that they're only temporarily closed in order to be eligible. All right, so just some final thoughts on those two IFRs. As with the first round, you should really work with your advisors if there's any uncertainty about eligibility to confirm that you are in fact eligible for either a first-time PPP loan or a second draw loan. And you want to make sure you substantiate that with your internal documentation and processes. If you're a prospective second draw PPP borrower, again, I just say take a look at the SBA's definition of gross receipts in the loan application form to make sure that the way you measure revenue or receipts is not materially different compared to the way SBA does, because you'll need to certify that you are eligible, which means you're certifying that you had that 25% reduction that's required for the second draw loan. That's not a requirement, by the way, for the first draw loans. Just to be clear, the first draw loans, you still need to make the need certification as you do for a second draw loan, but there's not a bright line 25% gross receipts reduction requirement for borrowers who never received an original PPP loan and would be applying for the first time. And then we talked about this last point already, that the larger borrowers in excess of $150,000 need to substantiate their gross receipts reduction at the time that they apply. So it's very important to make sure you've got that documentation organized and kind of vetted with your lender when you go to apply for the loan. So moving on from the IFRs to the actual updated loan applications. So these are not the forgiveness applications. These are the updated actual application forms for a first draw or a second draw PPP loan to reflect the latest amendments to program rules. As I just alluded to, both the first draw and second draw PPP loan applications continue to retain the need certification, which is required under the law, which is where the borrower certifies that given the current, paraphrasing here, based on the current economic uncertainty, they need the loan, either the first or the second draw loan, to support ongoing business operations, and that the loan is necessary to support ongoing business operations. So even with the second draw loans having that 25% bright line eligibility test, you still need to make the need certification. And it's not clear to me, and I think it will be after they update the FAQs, whether there's going to be any kind of safe harbor for the second round PPP loan applications based on the size of the loan and as it relates to the need certification. People may remember that in the first round, the SBA basically granted a safe harbor to all loans below $2 million when you factor in affiliation and everything. If the amount of total affiliated party loans is below $2 million, then you basically got a waiver from this need certification scrutiny. It's unclear if that waiver will continue to apply in the second draw portion or not. So something we'll look for in the updated FAQs and any other guidance. Another note about both new application forms, which is probably more important for new first-time borrowers to the PPP, is that the application form is now requesting your NAICS, your industry code up front. the original application forms, I don't believe ever requested this information be included on the loan application form. And now not only is the information requested up front, but the instructions state that you need to report the same industry code that you use on your federal tax returns, if applicable. And the reason this is important for first draw loans in particular, but it's important for everybody to be aware of so that they report correctly on their application. But for first draw borrowers, this could impact your eligibility for an increased employee cap based on your industry. So you need to take a look at, what industry code you're using for your tax returns and make sure that that aligns with what you do for your original first round loan application or your follow-up application. There's no kind of retroactive impact of this that I can see in the rulemaking. I know some borrowers had a hard time kind of figuring out what their primary NAICS code was for the first round. And there was really no guidance that was particularly useful other than, you should look at which code is predominantly, does your business operation relate to. But now there's this guidance related to your tax returns that you should be aware of in the instructions to the loan application. And then related to that, the last point here, it's now clear that for second draw loans, borrowers cannot take advantage of the SBA's alternative size standard or use an NAICS code to increase the maximum employee amount. So there's a cap of 300 employees in general for second draw PPP loans. The first round had a 500 employee cap, but there could be some exceptions to that based on your industry code or whether you satisfy the alternative size standard. That flexibility is still available for first draw loans so that there's parity between the original program terms and the relaunch of the program. But that flexibility is not there for second draw loans. Okay. So in terms of expected next steps and pending guidance, as I mentioned a few times, the SBA is in the process of updating their FAQs, which will be important, and we'll keep an eye out for that. And again, those are relatively easy to find on both the Treasury and SBA websites related to small business or PPP assistance, if you're curious to look at them. And they do update them without a lot of notice. So they'll just post the new version typically without necessarily making some kind of a public announcement, unless it's in a very important a very important FAQ. And then in terms of other guidance and forms that we're expecting on the forgiveness side, as opposed to the loan application side, SBA is going to need to, and they've said they're going to do this, issue an updated consolidated interim final rule on loan forgiveness processes, which will be helpful to have all that guidance in one rulemaking, but it's not been issued yet. And then similarly, the SBA needs to update the loan forgiveness application forms and some other miscellaneous forms to conform to the latest rulemaking. So, for example, to allow for reporting of forgiveness for employee safety expenditures and things like that. So that's not available yet if you haven't applied for forgiveness in the first round. You may want to wait until those come out, but you don't need to. I believe you could still use the current loan forgiveness application forms if you wanted to do that. But you should work with your lender to confirm that they are able, in fact, to process those current versions of the loan forgiveness application form. Okay, so we'll keep an eye out for those developments, I'm sure, and communicate anything material there through our client alerts and the like. Okay, and then this is sort of a separate tangent that I just wanted to briefly touch on. You may have received communications from your accountant or payroll provider, if you use one, about the retroactive expansion of the employee retention credit. Originally, if a PPP borrower received any forgiveness of a PPP loan, then they would be kind of per se ineligible for employee retention credits, which, and all this could be its own webinar, so I'm just going to touch on it very briefly. But the main takeaway here is you should consult with if you haven't already applied for forgiveness on your first draw PPP loan, you should connect with your accountants and or other trusted financial advisors to make sure you're thinking about these forgiveness, the PPP forgiveness and the employee retention credits in tandem, because, and this is the main point, is you cannot, although it's now permissible to participate both in PPP forgiveness and the employee retention credits, you cannot use a forgiven expenditure under the PPP as basically an underlying qualifying wage for the employee retention credit. So you just want to make sure, I guess my point is you just want to talk to your accountants to make sure that by claiming forgiveness, for example, on an excessive amount of payroll costs, that's not negatively impacting your ability to use the employee retention credit benefit. And for example, that might argue in some cases in favor of limiting your payroll costs in your forgiveness request closer to that 60% floor and using some of those expanded categories of forgivable expenditures and expenses so that you leave more payroll costs available for the ERC if that's the way it works out for you. So that we don't have time to dive really in depth into that, but I just wanted to note that interaction between those two aspects of this updated stimulus bill. And I think it's important for people to get their arms around those things holistically rather than kind of treat them separately. Okay, so we'll wrap up and do some Q&A briefly. We've still got 10 minutes until 9, and I can probably stay a little later for the Q&A, but my main conclusions are there are actually relatively few surprises or additional requirements included in the IFRs, at least compared to the initial rollout of the PPP in March and April of 2020, when there were constantly surprises and additional requirements imposed by Treasury and SBA. This guidance, in my opinion anyway, stayed pretty true to the legislation, and while there were some clarifications for more flexibility and for eligibility and establishing eligibility and things like that, there weren't like wholesale additional requirements imposed that were total surprises, I think. That said, it's still critical to make sure you organize and vet your eligibility and your loan calculation information before you apply, so that you have a good process in place to, for example, and this ties into the next bullet point, establish that you really considered whether you need the loan and can make that need certification, even if for a second draw loan, for example, you did have a really bad year-over-year quarter that exceeded a 25% decline in gross receipts. You still need to think through those certifications that you're going to be making in the loan application that you would need to support with. You potentially would need to support with documentation if you were ever audited or reviewed. And then you want to obviously keep those files that support your eligibility and your loan amount in case you do get subject to audit or review in the future. And then just one thing that I guess I'd note that can get lost in the mix of applying for PPP loans is that, you want to make sure that if this is something that applying for a PPP loan or receiving a PPP loan, it's still a loan technically, even though it's forgivable. So if that's something that requires board or shareholder approval, or, you have large shareholders who are being deemed to have made certain certifications in the loan application form, for example, that any 20% plus owner has not been convicted of certain types of crimes, or that they're not a resident of China for a second draw loan, for example, that you actually you go through, you get that information verified and authorized to make those representations in the application form. And then if you have an existing lender, there may be restrictions on incurring new debt in your document. So these are just things that you want to make sure you think about and get any required approvals if it's necessary to do that. And then lastly, just remember that a lot of this, pretty much, it appears all the major information about PPP could become public through either FOIA requests or government reporting or congressional, reporting. So just be mindful of that, and the fact that if you do make false certifications or misuse of funds or misrepresent anything, there are potential civil and or criminal sanctions in the forms of fines or potentially prison if it's a serious infraction. So that is the end of the planned presentation and webinar. It looks like we've got some Q&A lined up, which I'm going to go to now for a little bit. There's contact information for me if you want to reach out with any specific questions. And I'm going to take as many of the Q&A in the chat box here as I can. And if I skip over yours because it's a little too specific, you can feel free to follow up with me about this. There's a question about the set-asides under the PPP, the updated PPP. I'm not going to get into all the detail around that. It's pretty well summarized on the SBA's website, but basically on the borrower side, the set-asides relate to, for example, businesses and eligible borrowers in certain low-income areas or businesses with fewer than 10 employees. So there are a number of different set-asides. It would be beyond the scope to describe all of them, but there's somewhere in the neighborhood of, depending on which set-asides you're thinking about, it could be $15 to $30 billion in set-asides for various specific borrowers or lenders. So that's something you can find, I think, on the SBA's website, and your banks will probably be aware of that as well. Has the SBA mentioned when non-CFIs will be able to start originating first and second draw loans? I have not seen that yet. It's possible that they're making an announcement sometime this week, or may have made one today. I didn't see one yesterday or this morning, but that's something that I presume SBA will communicate out via press release or email update. And so there again, I guess I'd recommend it's helpful to sign up for SBA's alerts. They're not always the most timely. A lot of times things will get posted on the SBA's website before they send out an email to their listserv, but it does keep you somewhat informed of when major things like that change about the program. So if you haven't already signed up for SBA's email alerts, recommend doing that. There's a question, does the first PPP loan need to be forgiven before applying for a second loan? We kind of touched on that during the presentation, and this question may have occurred before that, but no, you don't need to have applied for forgiveness before you apply for the second loan. But if you have applied for forgiveness and your loan's under review, that may delay getting funded. And it is a requirement that you have fully spent the first loan on eligible expenses before you can apply for a second loan, and you need to certify that in the second loan application. There's a question about, can you use a rolling quarter or I guess any 3-month period, even though it's not a fifth. Let me make sure I'm reading this question correctly. I think so. Basically, if you have 3-month period that doesn't align with one of the calendar quarters, can you use that as a year-over-year quarterly decline? I don't believe so. There's nothing in the guidance in the rulemaking that says you can do that, and everything seems to reference calendar quarters. We'll see in the FAQs if there's any flexibility provided for borrowers who have a fiscal year that doesn't align neatly with that structure. It's possible that they will accommodate that, but right now there's no indication that you could use anything but the calendar quarters. For the revenue requirement, any thoughts on if you would still be eligible if your LLC is structured to have no revenue and all the true revenue hits an affiliate? In this case, the tax ID number would show the 25% loss, even though all payroll expenses are under the first. If they're affiliates, this is a fairly specific question, but I think you'd want to look at the revenue on a combined basis and report it out that way when you make sure you're upfront with your lender and the SBA about how you're reporting and measuring that in your second loan application. But I don't think that would be problematic as long as you're, again, making the disclosure about how that's structured and who the affiliate is and the like. But definitely not a question that's addressed by the current guidance or FAQs. Other than that, affiliation concepts generally are going to group those sorts of things together. Question on where can we find the PPP2 loan application? It's available in a couple of places. The Treasury Department has a website. If you Google Treasury CARES, like as in CARES Act, there will be a link to support for small businesses, or assistance for small businesses, and that has all of the resources, the public-facing resources for PPP, including the loan application form and the PPP IFRs and things like that. The SBA's website is also another good resource. You can click through to the COVID-19 funding options, and they have a whole web page that breaks down both the PPP, other lending options, I presume eventually the shuttered venue operator grants, and that has all the documentation as well. So you can get it through either the Treasury or SBA websites. For the second draw PPP, just confirming we do not have to have the tax return available when we apply for the funds. We just need to be able to apply and correct. We have internal documentation substantiating 25% drop in revenue, but the tax return will not be available until later, right? So you only need to have the tax return for 2020 available if you're using the full year 2020 compared to full year 2019 as the two comparable periods for your 25% decline in gross receipts. If you're using just a quarter, you don't need to have your tax return, but if your loans are going to be above 150,000, you do need to have some kind of substantiating calculation and documentation to support that at the time you submit your loan application for the second loan. Only loans below 150,000 can you just certify that you experienced that decline and then provide the support later. Question here, is the 300 employee limit for second draw loans the number of employees as of the date of the second draw application, or is it total employees in the 12-month period? That's a good question. It's definitely not going to be just, or I should never say definitely with anything related to the PPP, but I don't believe it will be as of the time you apply for your loan. It'll probably be over a look back period, and it will probably be the average number of employees that you had during whichever of those 3 periods you use to measure average monthly payroll costs. So we have to wait to see the FAQs get updated, but the original FAQ said whichever period you use to calculate your average monthly payroll costs, you basically look at that same period and calculate your average employment over that same period. So it'll probably be 2019, 2020, or the 12 months prior to the loan application. But we need to see that in the updated FAQs. That's a good question. They're all good questions. Sorry, that one is one I probably should have addressed proactively in the webinar. All right, it's a little past 9. I'm going to keep going for a few minutes. Has the first loan PPP forgiveness forms for loans below $150,000 been released? So the December stimulus bill required SBA to publish a new loan forgiveness application. That form has not yet been released. As far as I haven't seen it released on their public-facing websites yet. There are other loan forgiveness applications available for smaller loans, but if you're below 150,000 and waiting for that super simple one-page forgiveness application form, I don't believe that one's been posted yet. Is SBA giving the same safe harbor need satisfaction for loans of $2 million or less? Yeah, another good question. And I guess we'll probably need to wait and see what the updated FAQs say about that. That safe harbor was originally and still is included. I think it's FAQ number 46 in the frequently asked questions. So we'll see how they update that as it relates to second round loans, but I don't know the answer to that one right now. For second draw loan, would HH stimulus funds receipts be counted as gross receipts? Potentially. There's nothing in the rules that would exclude those stimulus funds from the definition. There is a specific exclusion for forgiven PPP loan receipts. I haven't read through SBA's definition of gross receipts with that particular issue in mind, so I can't kind of weigh in on as it relates specifically to HHS stimulus funds, but it is a fairly expansive definition of gross receipts, so it could be that those are included. You want to take a look at that more closely or follow up with an accountant or us to make sure that you're thinking about that correctly. But I generally would err on the side of inclusion if it's a close call. Answer one or two more questions here. There's a lot of questions about how do you calculate gross receipts depending on accrual versus cash method. I believe the law actually requires you to use the accrual method of accounting to calculate your 25% reduction in gross receipts. I think we covered that in the first webinar back in December, but that's something you want to confirm with your accountants if you're working with one, and establishing, the reporting to substantiate the 25% decline for the second loan. There was another question on will there be any further clarification on the need certification? I hope so, but again, we don't know right now. Probably won't know until the FAQs are updated. And then there's some other questions about different like what's covered by the different categories of supplier costs or operating expenses, some of these new categories of forgivable expenses. They are fairly specific definitions, so you should vet those carefully before you claim forgiveness on those items, because it's not just all supplier costs, for example, or all operating expenses. There are limitations. For example, for operating expenses, it seems to be limited to like licensing and cloud services fees for certain things, and on supplier costs, it's got to be either like an essential vendor, or there's a reference to vendors of perishable goods. So it's not just all-encompassing kind of any supplier costs or any operating costs. There are detailed definitions, which we don't have time to get into right now, but I would encourage you to make sure you're looking at those before you claim forgiveness in those categories. So that's, and then there's another question about for the employee retention credit, which is, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to provide an answer on this question because it's a little outside of the purview of kind of what I prepared for here today on the PPP, but a question about whether the Michigan executive orders would constitute having your operations fully or partially suspended due to COVID-19. I would encourage you to follow up with us separately on that. So we can I don't want to weigh in on tax questions. I'm not a tax attorney. It seems like there's an intuitive answer there, but I want to make sure that I'm providing guidance that's consistent with our tax group here at Miller Johnson. So you can follow up with us separately about that question if you'd like to, and we probably will end up doing some kind of an alert on the ERC expansion generally. So you can keep a lookout for that, or perhaps a webinar. All right. So thanks for hanging in there. Looks like quite a few folks stayed for the extra 8 minutes of Q&A here. Again, we really appreciate everybody's involvement and engagement. A lot of the times for me, getting these questions through the Q&A helps spark new thoughts about the program or new follow-up that I might have with clients or with you participants in the webinar. So thank you so much for attending, and I hope you're all staying healthy and doing well. Otherwise, we'll continue to monitor developments in this area and alert our listserv as appropriate. And if you want to sign up for our distribution list and you're not already, I think you can reach out to me or to anybody else in our marketing team through our website to do that. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.